Joined now by Alex Newman, our international correspondent. Alex, thanks as always for taking the time to join us on this Friday.
It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me, Duke.
So Virginia has become really the epicenter, isn't it, of what's going on with the out-of-control public schools. It's surpassed California and Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey. It seems like every day there's a new outrage from counties like Loudoun County and Fairfax County. These are highly Democrat enclaves close to Washington, D.C. They are incredibly rich, wealthy counties that have just tens and tens and thousands of students. So this is really an epicenter for the fight against critical race theory and everything else. Now we find out that a good sign, the NAACP actually told Fairfax School District, stop producing illiterate black kids, right? This is a big slap in the face to an organization, the school boards of Fairfax, that see themselves perfectly in line with Black Lives Matter groups.
It is. It's a very interesting letter. In my personal opinion, it falls well short of where it needs to be, but I think it's a really important first step, because what the NAACP is saying in this letter is that, look, you people have been using for decades quack methodologies to teach reading that are turning black children into illiterates. Now, I don't see this really as a racial issue, and I don't like that the NAACP is racializing it. Yes, the data does show that black children of African heritage, suffer even more from the quackery than children of European heritage. But the point is, they're using quackery that's turning our children into illiterates. It's not a racial issue. But be that as it may, I was really pleased to see them call this out. They demanded that the schools start using proper phonics, right? And this is a distinction that I'm so glad the NAACP finally fell on. Once parents realized that their children were being turned into illiterates, they demanded phonics. Well, the schools responded by sprinkling a little bit of phonics onto the quackery and saying, "Oh, we're doing phonics. Don't look at us." Well, that was quackery with a little bit of phonics sprinkled on top. And so what the NAACP has done here is blown the whistle on this fraud. They've said, look, sprinkling a little bit of phonics on top of the quackery that's not working is not going to cut it anymore. We want a real, systematic, intensive phonics program that is actually going to teach our children how to read. And the fact that the NAACP both knows this and is willing to call it out is a really positive sign. However, I think they missed the point. Demanding that phonics be put back in the schools is not a real solution. If they can't teach your kids how to read properly, how in the world are they going to do the other things that parents expect schools to do?
Well, and the other part of that is that the NAACP is otherwise perfectly on board with critical race theory, with all of the 1619 garbage, with all of the leftist revisionists of history, the promotion of Black Lives Matter in the school, all of that non-schooling. This is what I thought was kind of odd. On the one hand, it is worth cheering that the NAACP wants black kids to read, and they realize that the American public school is no longer committed to that, number one. Number two, but that seems to run oppositionally, it runs to the other stuff. All that Black Lives Matter propaganda that's in the schools, all of that white shaming and white guilt and canceling great white figures because they happen to be white and doing math, the NAACP has nothing to say about that. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we know Fairfax is not going full on phonics. It's just not going to happen. I don't care what the NAACP says. But let's say that they did. And that they did it. They corrected the ways they teach reading. Then what would the NAACP's response be to the fact that from moving forward at that point, it's going to be one-stop, non-stop indoctrination education as opposed to real subject matter?
That's exactly right. And, the NAACP is not an organization that's interested in real education. And, just teaching people to read is a good thing, and that should be encouraged. But unfortunately, I don't think the NAACP is actually interested in really getting a good education for all these children. I mean, if they were, they would be calling for their members to get their children out of the public school system. They say in there that for 40 years, you people have been turning our children into illiterates with this quackery, despite all the research that shows what it's doing. doing. So how can you trust these people with your children? How can you trust them with the minds of your children? I think the NAACP is really falling short here, but this is an encouraging sign, I think.
Yeah, we can't be too hard on the NAACP. They're the last organization I would have thought would have come out for this. I can see the NCAA screaming and hollering for more racial justice. It never dawned on me that they would actually have looked at the phonics, so good on them. After the break, let's talk a little bit more about the broader implications of what's at stake here. Joined now by Alex Newman, our international correspondent. Alex, we had a great talk, I think, in the first segment about how the NAACP is stepping up a little. When you think about the saturation, all these white do-gooders in these Fairfax public schools, all these white administrators who feel that it's their job to push black agendas, if I may say it that way, in public schools, to force white kids to sort of bow at the altar of their own white guilt and white supremacy. For the NAACP to take a moment and say, to not necessarily comment on that, but to say, hey, that's all well and good, but our kids can't read. That is, like you said at the end of the last segment, a really good thing. Is there any way to move the NAACP or other black organizations, do you think, further to get them to participate in the Get Your Kids Out program? Seems to be a lot of beholdenness to teachers' unions and radical left-wing educrats on the part of black leadership. But still, what can be done to follow up on this to get more minorities, particularly blacks, involved with walking away?
Yeah, that's a great question, Duke. And, I think reading is one of those issues that's really transpartisan, right? Radical Democrats and Marxists and liberals, they all want their children to be able to learn how to read. It's not like only conservatives and only Republicans want their children to learn how to read. It's something that all parents really want for their children. And so this, I think, is an important issue. I think the next step now in the NAACP, whether they know this or not, I don't know. They certainly don't mention it in the letter. The next step is for them to understand that this was deliberate. So I encourage the leaders of the NAACP, if you're watching this video right now, get a copy of the book that Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I wrote back in 2015, Crimes of the Educators. We proved using primary source documents that this plan to turn not just the black children in Fairfax County, but all the children in America into either illiterates or children who couldn't or hate reading, that was a part of a strategic plan. And once you read that, you realize that this is not something that can be salvaged with a nasty letter, right? This is not like you can demand that they restore proper phonics and suddenly everything's going to get better. This was part of a deliberate plan. We actually have 2 chapters in our book on how the education establishment deliberately set out to create this black underclass, to destroy the black family, to dumb down black American children. And of course, they wanted to dumb down white American children as well, but they first experimented with this nonsense in the black community. And then when they realized how well it worked, then they moved it out to the rest of America. So this is all well documented. And if you're really interested in solving the so-called racial achievement gap, which is a big focus of this letter, the answers have been there all along. Okay, we talk in the book about Marva Collins, a wonderful black American educator in Chicago who took some of the most quote-unquote hopeless cases, right? Very, very troubled black children, black youth from troubled homes with delinquency in their past, things like this, and turned them into some of the brightest scholars out there who went on to become doctors and lawyers and, the highest educational level imaginable, way beyond even a lot of their white peers. And so if you want to close the racial achievement gap, so-called, the answers are there, but it has to start with the realization that they deliberately did this, okay? They're not idiots, NAACP. They knew what they were doing. They still know what they're doing. Maybe not the first grade teacher who's using the quack program that she was trained to use in a government education college, but the system, the people who run the system know perfectly well what they're doing, and you have to realize it was deliberate, or you'll never get to the root of the problem.
So we did spend a lot of time talking about the black response, and I think you're right. I mean, it's a stretch that there's going to be a serious African-American movement to walk away. That's just a hard thing to imagine right now in these early stages, but what the NAACP did was a good step forward. I'm also interested, before we go, how did the white liberals in Fairfax, you would think that they would be a little bit confused and shaking in their boots. The very organization, the very people they say they're doing this for just read them the Riot Act. And so what do you think do we have any indication about how the white limousine liberals who are speaking on behalf of black people in classrooms now, appropriating black culture, white administrators and white teachers teaching Black Lives Matter ideology, do you have any idea how the school has responded to this?
Almost not at all. There's almost nothing out there about this letter. It was sent to the school superintendent, and almost nothing. No media coverage, no response. But I am encouraged by some things here, and one of the things that I want to say in the last few seconds that we have, Duke, is that the data on homeschooling that just came out from the Census Bureau earlier this year shows that Black Americans are leaving the government brainwash camp in droves. In fact, Black families are now more likely to homeschool than white families and families of European heritage, and this trend is accelerating. Now we're up at like 16% of Black families with children of school age are out of the school system. This is really, really good news, and I hope it will continue.